Hello and welcome to Dialogue. In recent years, the relationship between China and Australia has reached a historic low. But what's brought bilateral ties to this stage? And looking globally, what does democracy mean for each country in different contexts? And how can we successfully manage our relationship going forward? That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Recently the U.S. has been listed as a backsliding democracy by a European think tank. Is it Donald Trump himself to blame, or is there something beyond Donald Trump about the U.S. democracy?
I think American democracy is in trouble. I believe it is faltering. You have restrictions on voter participation enacted by Republican-controlled states. In other words, they're making it harder, not easier, for poorer people or coloured people to get registered as voters and to get to a polling booth and to get into that polling booth and cast a vote. Now, I believe that is tugging America in an oligarchic direction. American democracy is in trouble because Republicans have made it harder for voters to participate in elections. And since Trump's defeat, they've enacted laws and procedures that would make it easier for state officials to overturn or reverse the decision of voters in a future presidential election. Now, that is very serious, and it's a retreat from democratic practices. The US Supreme Court has negated previous regulations, negated laws, I should say, that overrode state-level restrictions on voter participation. And these are retrograde steps. These are very retrograde steps. And some people have expressed the view, I'm one of them, that America is best not seen as a democracy because of these practices, very largely because of these practices and because of the power of the US Senate, which is not elected on a democratic basis. It's better to see America as a republic with constitutionally entrenched freedom of expression. I find this a more useful summation of the American political system.
Well, adding to that, you see, currently we are still in the middle of this pandemic, which has created these new problems in social governance, global supply chains, even human rights. And we are seeing protests, sometimes violent against the COVID prevention measures, not only Australia, but also European countries, developed parts of the world. Do you think the pandemic has caused a second thoughts on governance in a democratic society, for example?
It's fed a populist challenge to the authority of leaders in the Western world. It's been adopted by some in America, by some of the followers of Donald Trump. They've been recruited to conspiratorial theories about vaccination. And it's fed into a popular American concept that we will not be pushed around and told what to do by the state. So it's a serious and it's a disruptive force. It's an irrational force. It's asserting the right of people not to be vaccinated over the right of people whose health is vulnerable to be protected from exposure to this virus. It is a disruptive force. How disruptive we may see in the forthcoming French elections.
Overall, what do you think of this performance, of say Western democratic government, like in European countries, in the US, I mean, Australia has done a good job, and so is New Zealand. But what about those other developed world?
Yeah, Australia lagged at first, but now it's got a very respectable rate of double vaccination, and people are getting booster shots as well. New Zealand too. Clearly something went wrong with those wealthy and otherwise very rational countries, Germany and Austria, where the double vaccination rate is in the 60s. And that suggests something badly wrong, a level of resistance to vaccination that you wouldn't expect in an advanced democracy. I just wonder whether the people opposing vaccination would have considered opposing vaccination to protect children against polio when this became widespread in the 50s and 60s and later, I guess, in developing countries. We restrict people's freedoms in all sorts of ways. Around the world, we don't allow people to smoke in the workplace because non-smokers have got a right not to have their lungs filled with smoke by selfish people who assert a right to smoke at all times and in all places. We restrict the right of people to drive their cars while drunk, while affected by alcohol. These are reasonable restraints. By restricting so-called freedoms of some people, they enhance the freedoms of others. So this is all a matter of trade-offs, and so it should be seen with vaccination.
Well, health issue or freedom issue, the debate, I also want to have your opinions on China. During a conference in October, Chinese President Xi Jinping said that democracy is not for decoration, but for solving the problems that the people need to solve. And how many promises are fulfilled after the election matters more than what promises are made during it. In terms of political efficiency, how do you think, look at the way China practicing its democracy for its development? Do you think China demonstrates democracy in its own way, or still has some fundamental divergence with the ultimate value of it?
I'd like to see more expression of dissident views in China. I think that would be healthy. I think China's got an opportunity to demonstrate the resilience of its system in two standout respects. One is by dealing with the issues of inequality. The commitment President Xi has made to broader prosperity, to see that no Chinese is left behind, to take a Western slogan, involves a redistribution of wealth. Can he solve the problems of inequality where Western countries have failed? Now that's a big commitment. And I think the world will be interested in common prosperity as promoted by China at the present time. I think the other one is response to climate. It is very encouraging that the US and China have reached an agreement on an agenda on climate that is very comprehensive, including the measurement, detailed commitments to the measurement of methane entering the upper atmosphere. And China has got the opportunity. I welcome China's decision to decarbonize the Belt and Road. I welcome China's commitment to renewable energy. And when the current short-term energy crunch is over, I think China's got an opportunity to accelerate the shift away from coal. And that will be quite inspirational and send a powerful message to the world on climate. So in social equality and delivering on climate, China has a credible claim to be asserting leadership that will make Western democracies say, as strange as the Chinese political system is to us, it's been able to deliver on the two biggest challenges humankind faces.
The United States will be holding what it calls the Summit for Democracy early this month. which is set to focus on challenges and opportunities facing democracies, and will provide a platform to announce, for individual countries, commitments, reforms, and initiatives. Can you give your comments on the context, the goals, and expected outcome of the conference?
I think the conference is a fine idea. Countries that brand themselves as democracies are entitled to come together, as they've done over the years in different forums, and share their experiences. But it should be seen as involving obligations. President Biden is entitled to say to his Congress, we make an international commitment on democracy. There should be no place in the United States for laws at the state level that restrict the right of voters to turn out and record a vote, as many Republican-controlled states are attempting to do through blatant voter suppression laws. And America's entitlement to convene a meeting of the world's democracies really does rest on America demonstrating that it is a democracy, not, as I suggested a moment ago, a liberal republic that deserves praise for freedom of speech, but a thoroughgoing democracy where the right to vote is entrenched and respected. You can't say America does that at the present time because of Republican-sponsored voter suppression laws.
Well, there's a criticism that, or concern, you can say, with this democracy summit. Some countries would say Biden government is creating new blocs, like new, different camps confronting each other by saying democracy versus non-democracy. Do you have similar concerns about that?
No, I think countries will always recognize foreign policy realism. And that mandates that in the spirit of the Westphalian system established by treaty in 1648, countries will deal with one another to promote common interests, for peace and security, for example, and for action on climate change, setting aside differences over the domestic policy of each respective government. So the challenge of globally resolving great challenges, preeminently climate, avoiding nuclear war, saving the world's oceans, these are problems that know no borders. And democracies and non-democracies have got to cooperate. But I also favour dialogue between different systems.
So Mr. Carr, next year will mark this 50th anniversary of the establishment of China-Australia diplomatic relations. How would you summarize the past 5 decades? Now we all say probably, we all agree that bilateral relationship is now at a low point. From your point of view, what do you think has brought bilateral ties to this stage today?
Australia made a deliberate decision under the Prime Ministership of Malcolm Turnbull to tilt against China beginning in early 2017. There was no action on the Chinese side that warranted it. Australia opted to say we needed a bigger American military presence in the region, the implication being to counter China. And our foreign minister said China wouldn't be great until it became a democracy. So these were seen as departures, rhetorical departures from the language that all Australian governments had used about the China-Australia bilateral relationship up until 2017. The media collaborated with the Turnbull government in creating a China panic. And I was reading in Australian newspapers material about Chinese students in Australia that was just patently untrue. I was reading that Chinese students in Australia had engaged in ethno-nationalistic behaviour. Entirely untrue. 300,000 Chinese students in Australia at the time. There were no incidents that supported this defamatory and hysterical attack on students who were paying my country great honour by choosing to study at its campuses when they could have studied at American or Canadian or European campuses. So Australia took a deliberate decision to tilt against China. We opted to use Cold War rhetoric. I would be critical of some of the responses by China. I thought China would have been better advised to have ignored these Australian provocations and to have behaved like a civilizational power and said, well, look, when Australia's ready to talk amicably to us again, we'll pick up the dialogue. But China gave the impression of wanting to respond to every rhetorical flourish coming from the anti-Chinese elements in Australia. And then in Australia specifically made a great feature of banning Huawei from providing our 5G network, and then turned an attempt to get an inquiry into the early management of the COVID virus into an anti-Chinese statement. I mean, that was entirely unnecessary. I'm on record writing articles in the Australian media about both these matters, the handling of Huawei and the handling of the bid for a COVID inquiry, where I said it was not the decisions themselves, but the way Australia projected them to China and the world that produced a deterioration in the relationship. I regret the fact that China responded by taking action on trade to disadvantage Australia. I imagine China gets some satisfaction from seeing the United States itself pick up the trade opportunities in China that Australia sacrificed by being such a flamboyant and high-profile critic of China when, from my point of view, diplomatic language could have served every task we wanted.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of China-Australia relationship. Probably you have to talk about the U.S. At a conference last year, you had a debate with former Prime Minister Tony Abbott on handling ties with the U.S. and China, in which you said Australia should adopt more practical policies while dealing with China instead of simply following the steps of the U.S. 1 year on, and after a new president in the U.S., do you still have the same view?
Here's my view, that an Australian Prime Minister should be saying to an American President, we are very committed allies. We maintain a close relationship. In fact, you've got no more useful ally than Australia. We contribute to an alliance relationship in all sorts of ways, and it suits us to have a strong ally. However, we want to maintain a pragmatic working relationship with Beijing. And we want to do it because it's in our interests, and the Australian people benefit. They benefit from the trade, but also because we want to have a role in dialogue with China. And China has in the past taken Australian views very seriously and has valued its dialogue with China. We don't compromise in our views on human rights. We're not going to overlook our differences with China over its conduct in the South China Sea. We want to have a dialogue with China about these things. We want to manage our differences diplomatically. But this is what an Australian Prime Minister should be saying to the American President. We expect you to understand that our relationship with you does not preclude a creative partnership with China and its people. Now, I regret that has been a level of diplomacy too sophisticated for the people who hold power in Canberra at the present time, and they think the only way to manage the partnership with the US, the alliance with the US, is to sacrifice the partnership with China. And I've regretted that, and I've said that on many occasions.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're now witnessing rising tensions across the Taiwan Strait, and discussion, of course, on this reunification, the mainland and Taiwan. Meanwhile, we are sometimes hearing, rather radical comments from Australian politicians. For example, the Defense Minister, Peter Dutton, recently said, China will make Australia a tributary state after taking over Taiwan. What do you make of such rhetorics, the popularity of these, I would say, anti-China sentiment in Australia?
A lot of Australians agree with me that Defence Minister Dutton is engaged in very dangerous work. Now, it's interesting that his colleague, the Foreign Minister, used altogether different rhetoric. What is important for both sides is to return to the previous status quo on Taiwan, to enhance peace and security by returning to the cross-states status quo. There's no need for me to spell out what that is. All of us know what that status quo has been, and it's preserved the peace for decades. It's been satisfactory, and it's been satisfactory to the US. In fact, one of the best manifestations of China-US relations has been, under previous presidents, managing diplomatically the tensions in cross-straits relations. So let's return to that status quo.
Well,
and I think the rhetoric by Defence Minister Dutton has been deplored by many Australians because he seems to be saying the chances of conflict here are high, and Australia should exercise no independent judgment but be with America instantly and overnight. That has not been historically the Australian position.
Well, you mentioned a very good point. Obviously, a lot of people would agree with you probably. The Taiwan issue is really about China-U.S. relationship because of the change of the nature somehow. Previously, engagement between China and the U.S. And then you have Donald Trump. They have this the change of the policy from engagement to strategic competition. And then, of course, the Taiwan issue somehow, from the Chinese perspective, is being used or being played by the U.S. against China. And somehow Australia is more or less getting involved. And there's even talk about, military conflicts. Australia is a small country, relatively speaking, to China, for example. Why some politicians are even talking about a war?
I think there are people in Australia who think that Australia is always threatened from Asia. There are people in Australia who are alarmed by the rise of China. They believe the only response to the diplomatic challenges associated with the re-emergence of China to great power status is to impress the United States with the further of our anti-Chinese position. This is crude, it's undiplomatic, and a lot of Australians are very uneasy with it, but it has taken hold with the current government. I think my advice to China is when they view what Chinese see as provocations from Australia, to rise above it, not to engage in what gets described as wolf warrior diplomacy, but to regard Australia as a big power would regard a nation with leaders drawn to a middle power, with leaders drawn to feisty or belligerent rhetoric, but likely to exhaust themselves because the rhetoric leads Australia simply to a strategic dead end. The other allies of the United States, one can think of Japan or the Europeans, Canada, New Zealand, still have viable relations with China. It's only Australia that has burnt those relations.
Mm-hmm. Well, China has applied to join the CPTPP, which Australia is a part of. Where would you say Australia stands on the entrance of China, the application, considering this current political climate between the two countries?
I would encourage Canberra to begin talks with China, to offer to talk with China about China's entry. And I'd encourage China in that context to find ways of restoring trade relations with Australia in those areas where China for various reasons, has announced barriers to Australian trade. I think it's a big step forward for China to join the agreement. And if China can persuade the organisation to accept Chinese membership, it'd be a very important statement about China's support for open world trading systems.
Some would say that's also an opportunity, for Australia and China to talk to each other and improve their relationship by, talking about CPTPP application.
I agree with that. That's the approach I would take. An opportunity for us to sit down together and attempt to reset the relationship and restart it.
Lastly, do you think the two countries can go back to relatively good times in the foreseeable future, China and Australia?
Sadly, I'm pessimistic. I'm pessimistic because some people in Australian politics, on the conservative side of Australian politics, see a political advantage in stirring up a fear of China and claiming that the other side of politics is soft on China. And that sacrifices Australia's interest, which should be to enhance our own economy by cooperating with China as it completes its trajectory towards becoming a wealthy nation. And it sacrifices the opportunity for us to engage with China on many different fronts and to influence China by talking about an Australian perspective on Australia-China relations. There are too many people in my country who think Australia can have one international personality, and that is as an ally of the US. I favour making that one aspect of our international personality.
It's a bit unfortunate. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to Mr. Carr. You can also watch us on CGTN app on our YouTube. I'm Xu Qianduo. Thanks for watching. See you next time.